Welcome into the Brookline.News podcast. I'm Sam Mintz, the editor of Brookline.News. We're an online, nonprofit local news outlet covering the town of Brookline. And I'm here with Jessica Smyser, who's the executive director of Brookline Interactive Group. And we're here to talk about the news.
Hi, Sam.
Hey, Jessica, how are you doing?
I'm doing well, thank you.
Our podcast this week is sponsored by Amy Lipton Real Estate. Amy is a local resident and award-winning realtor at Coldwell Banker in Chestnut Hill. We'd like to thank Amy for being the first sponsor of this podcast.
Woohoo! So starting off with a serious topic, the FBI considered using a controversial law enforcement technique called a geofence warrant to open a federal investigation into an act of anti-Semitic vandalism in Brookline. Can you tell us more about that?
Yeah, so I wrote this story and I first got onto it because this blogger, a guy named Nathaniel Story, had published these records which he had requested from the town of Brookline, from the police department. They were a really interesting trove of emails by the police department and other town officials related to this incident at the butchery earlier this summer, in which someone or two people had allegedly thrown a brick reading Free Palestine written on it in marker through the window of the butchery, which is a local Jewish kosher grocery store in Coolidge Corner. And there was a lot of interesting stuff in these emails, but what I decided to write about was this revelation that the FBI, this FBI agent had considered launching their own federal investigation into this crime, which has not been solved, is not been figured out by Brookline police. And in fact, that they had been considering doing so using this controversial technique called a geofence warrant. Just to very briefly describe what that is, it's basically asking Google or another tech provider to give records of every device, phone, tablet, et cetera, that was in a very specific area. So in this case, presumably it would be the area of the butchery at a very specific time, overnight when this incident happened. Ultimately, the FBI did not open that investigation. They were not able to use that warrant according to these emails, but it's a really interesting update on this, crime that was a really significant one to the Brookline community.
Well, obviously it's a scary thing to happen and we want to find out who did it. But the geofence thing does sound a little scary in other ways. And one thing you say in your story is that more recently, geofence warrants have been criticized by judges and others for threatening the privacy of those whose phone data is collected. Last year, a federal appeals court found that geofence warrants are categorically prohibited by the Fourth Amendment. And just because we like people to know what we're talking about, I looked up what the Fourth Amendment was. And the Fourth Amendment protects the American people from unreasonable searches and seizures by the government, ensuring that law enforcement must generally have a warrant based on probable cause. So that's when we hear people talking about legal search and seizure, probable cause, that's the Fourth Amendment. So in theory, if they use this geofence technique, then anybody who's in the vicinity, their data is captured. Is that correct?
Yeah, basically. And I think there is some nuance to it about what specifically they'd be collecting and whether what they're collecting would be, anonymized or aggregated, whether they'd have to then put in another warrant to Google to say, oh, here are the specific suspect devices from this first data set you sent us that we'd then like to, find out more information about. So, that first sort of dragnet of devices might not necessarily be specifically linked to people, but I think that, privacy activists, advocates would basically say, under the Fourth Amendment, it's a illegal search and seizure to even collect that data from people's phones. And from the research I did for this story, it's a technique that law enforcement is using less because of these court rulings. And in this email, the FBI agent says she's no longer able to. She says we were looking into the possibility of obtaining a geofence, but it does not look like it's a possibility any longer per management. So that leaves plenty of questions about what specifically that means, but I thought it was just a really interesting look into, when something like this is happening here in Brookline, there's all this sort of behind the scenes conversations about how law enforcement can figure it out. And, just to note, as I said earlier, Brookline police have not been able to solve this. They basically said, for this story, they had no updates. The email showed that they were collecting some other surveillance footage of the surrounding areas, but, the people, two men who allegedly did this, were wearing masks and hoods, and there's been nothing that would identify them.
Well, people want to feel safe and people want to be safe, but I think that we've always looked at the balance between safety and privacy, but now there's more to look at. There's technologies and different techniques that can be brought into play that really is an interesting question of that balance between safety and privacy now.
And just as a little teaser, I'm working on another story about another way in which privacy and public safety sort of collide in Brookline specifically in the next couple of weeks when this comes out. So stay tuned.
Okay, we will look forward to reading that. So the next story we're going to talk about is about Starbucks. So 2 Starbucks locations in Brookline are closing as part of a major restructuring by the coffee chain that will shutter hundreds of stores, including more than 20 in Massachusetts. What can you tell us about this?
So yeah, these are 2 Brookline Starbucks that are closed. They're actually closed by the time we're producing this. They've been closed for a week or so now. One is in Coolidge Corner on Harvard Street, and the other is near Boston University on Commonwealth Avenue, the stretch that we talked about in the last episode that is right on the Boston border. Many people think it's Boston, but actually is in Brookline. And then our story also mentions the Cleveland Circle location, which is technically Boston, Brighton, but is very close to Brookline and used by a lot of people. And this is part of this huge cuts by Starbucks, the national chain, in response to some different issues, economic issues. One interesting note from our story is that all 3 of those local locations are ones where workers have unionized in recent years. Several Brookline locations which are not unionized are remaining open. The company did not say that was a reason for doing it. They cited some other stuff, including which stores were economically feasible, which stores had different interior designs and layouts. But it was interesting to note the trend of sort of unionized versus not unionized in which stores were closed.
Well, one of the things I gathered from the statement from Starbucks was they want to go back to what they call a core brand. It seemed like they were saying that having a coffee shop where people could sit and enjoy a kind of cafe feeling was part of their core brand. And a lot of these stores that are closing are more like a grab and go. So, for example, the Putterham Plaza location in Brookline, the Starbucks location in Putterham, is not closing. And that is one that has an actual sit-down cafe. The location itself lends itself to that. It's more of a neighborhood feel. So is that what they're talking about? If we're thinking it's not about the unions and it's about this core brand issue, is that what they're saying their core brand is, more of this neighborhood cafe feeling?
Yeah, that's essentially what they said in this statement. But of course, it's hard to tell exactly what the reasoning is because they also talked about stores, quote, where we don't see a path to financial performance. And I think a lot of people noted in response to our story, at least the Coolidge Corner Starbucks is always packed. There's always people in there. Same with the Cleveland Circle one. It's hard to know exactly what's behind this, and I'm sure there's algorithms or other factors that go in. One interesting thing that I was going to mention is another response that a lot of people had to this story was at the risk of being blunt, good. Now some local business can come in instead of these chains. I know Starbucks certainly has its supporters too, so that's not the consensus opinion. But it'll be really interesting to see what comes into these really high traffic, well-placed storefronts. Coolidge Corner in particular has had a lot of turnover. There's still some vacancies, but it's a really interesting spot for a business. And those are, that's a great location. So I'll be curious to see what comes in.
Well, one thing I wanted to note is you did a story on it. There was a story about this in the Globe. It's been on national media. Starbucks closing is big news, which, what does that say about us as a society?
Yeah. One thing I've learned at Brookline.News is that people are just really deeply interested in business stories, and in particular business stories that are going to affect their daily lives or change the way that the town looks around them or give them different opportunities. I'm sure many of the people who read and commented on our stories were people who go to those Starbucks every day or who go to them on certain occasions or who specifically don't like Starbucks. So they would want something else to be there. And I really think it's something that people care so much about is just the world changing around them, and especially the sort of retail business world in Brookline.
The retail business, the brand business that we've come to kind of rely on as being kind of ubiquitous. It does feel like maybe it's trying to tell us something. Like if Starbucks can't survive, what does this mean, But it's just very interesting how people are very interested in and invested in what's going to happen to those stores and the loss of those stores.
We will keep an eye on the Duncans and Neros of the world and of Brookline as well.
Yes, we count on you for that. So the next story is, years after working together, a 93-year-old retired neurologist undergoes brain surgery by his mentee. So this 93-year-old neurologist was operated on by someone who he had mentored. Can you tell us more about this story?
Yeah, I love this story by BU student Hazel Nystrom, who's writing for us this semester. Just a really interesting human personal story, professional story about this doctor, William Weiner, who was a top neurologist at Metro West Medical Center. And he was a Brookline resident during much of his time there, which is why this is a relevant story for us. And he recently needed brain surgery himself. He had normal pressure hydrocephalus, NPH, as it's called, a neurological condition. He knew where to turn. It was his old hospital, and in fact, it was an old colleague that he had mentored in his many decades at the hospital. And just a really, interesting story. We got a lot of science in this story that is not really down my wheelhouse, but I found really interesting to read. And a very human story. Who do you turn to when you need help in the field that you're an expert in, but you're not able to obviously operate on your own brain? And also, he's 93, so of course he's not operating at all anymore. And just really enjoyed reading this story.
Well, first of all, the story does raise awareness about this condition, which apparently Billy Joel also has, and he's done some work to raise awareness for this condition. And second of all, I found it heartwarming and it did bring up the questions about relationship and mentorship. There were a couple quotes that I pulled out to talk about this. The one quote is from Mr. Weiner, who's the patient. "I knew this guy for years. I'd rather have somebody I know open up my brain than somebody I don't know." So that really stood out. And then the other quote I pulled is from the neurologist who did the surgery, who says, "The last thing I want is somebody I care for, who is my friend, to have a complication." So there we see two sides of the same coin, right? The patient who trusts that this person he knows can do it, and then the added pressure on the surgeon, someone he knows and presumably really cares for, even loves, to be in his care in that way. It makes it so personal in a way that we don't often think about surgery being.
Yeah, absolutely. And we should say the name of the neurosurgeon, Dr. Krishna Nirmal, of course, who's the one who performed what, by all accounts, was a very successful surgery on Dr. Weiner, his old mentor.
Yeah, it's a lovely story, and it really does make you think about, it's sweet to think about being in that position when you're 93 to be able to call upon people you know and love to help you and support you in really tangible ways. So really nice story.
One of our colleagues asked right before we started recording, who would you want to perform brain surgery on you? And I thought, well, shoot, I don't know any brain surgeons, so I'm going to be in trouble. I think I'd want a neurosurgeon, and I'm not friends with any of those, so I'm not calling in my soccer buddies or whatever.
Well, I guess we just need to start making the right friends. Just make a checklist of all the people that you're going to need going forward.
I've got a great friend who's a pediatrician. That doesn't help much today. So,
well, maybe someday.
Well, that's our show for today. Thanks so much for listening. As a reminder, please check out our work on www.Brookline.News. You can read all these stories and more, sign up for our newsletter, and all the rest.